The most popular piece of advice in the entire self-improvement space is 5 words long. Observe your thoughts. Do not react. It shows up everywhere. Meditation apps, therapy sessions, Stoic philosophy pages, YouTube videos with millions of views. And on the surface, it sounds right. Elegant, even. The idea that you can step back from the chaos inside your head, watch it like weather passing, and somehow find peace in the watching. There is just one problem. For most people, it does not work. Not because the advice is wrong, but because the advice is incomplete. There is a second half, and almost nobody teaches it. Before getting to what is missing, it is worth understanding where this idea came from. Because observe your thoughts did not start as a 5-word slogan. It started as a practice embedded in 2,500 years of contemplative tradition, Buddhist Vipassana, Stoic prososha, and later, clinical mindfulness developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts in the late 1970s. In each of these traditions, observation was never presented as a standalone instruction. It was one piece of a larger system. In Vipassana, observation is paired with equanimity, not just seeing the thought, but relating to it with a specific quality of non-preference. In Stoicism, prososha, attention, is tied to prohoresis, the faculty of choice. Observation without the capacity to choose a response is just spectatorship. Kabat-Zinn embedded observation inside an 8-week program with body scans, movement, guided inquiry, and group discussion. The point was never just watch. The point was watch and then something else. That something else is what got stripped away when the advice went mainstream. Now, here is what actually happens in the brain when you try to observe a thought. And this is where it gets specific, because the brain is not one thing, and observing is not one process. In 2007, a team led by Norman Farb at the University of Toronto published a study that changed how neuroscience understands self-awareness. They put participants in an fMRI scanner and asked them to engage with self-relevant information in 2 different ways. The first way, think about what this means for you, your life, your story, the narrative mode. The second way, just notice what you are experiencing right now in this moment as sensation, the experiential mode. What Farb found was that these 2 modes activated fundamentally different brain networks. The narrative mode lit up the medial prefrontal cortex, the same region involved in the default mode network, the same region that drives rumination, the same region that was running the overthinking loops from the last video. The experiential mode activated a different circuit entirely, the insula, the secondary somatosensory cortex, regions associated with body awareness and present moment sensory processing. 2 modes, 2 networks. And here is the critical finding: in untrained participants, these networks were highly correlated. They fired together. The narrative self and the experiential self were tangled. But in participants who had completed mindfulness training, the networks had become decoupled. They could activate one without automatically triggering the other. That decoupling, that is not observing your thoughts. That is a specific neurological shift that requires training. And without that training, telling someone to just observe is asking them to use the very network that generates the problem. This leads to the first mistake, and it is the most common one. Most people, when they try to observe their thoughts, observe with the thinking mind. They narrate the observation. A thought appears, nothing is going to work out, and they respond with another thought. Okay, I'm observing that thought. I notice I'm having a negative thought. Interesting. That is just a thought. This sounds like observation. It even feels like observation, but it is not. It is the default mode network talking to itself. It is thinking about thinking. The medial prefrontal cortex is still running the show. The experiential network, the insula, the body awareness circuits, has not been engaged at all. From the outside, it looks like mindfulness. From inside the brain, it is just another loop. A more sophisticated loop, perhaps. A loop dressed in meditation language. But a loop. And this is why so many people sit with their eyes closed for 10 minutes, observe their thoughts, and feel absolutely nothing change. They are running the same software and calling it something different. The second mistake is subtler, and it is almost the opposite of the first. Some people hear observe, don't react, and interpret it as observe, don't feel. They use observation as a form of suppression. A painful emotion arrives, grief, anger, shame, and instead of feeling it, they retreat into the observer position. They watch from a distance, they label it. There is anger, and then they wait for it to pass, as if naming the weather were the same as standing in the rain. There is a clinical term for this, experiential avoidance, and the research is clear that it does not reduce suffering, it delays it. Daniel Wagner's famous white bear experiments in the 1980s demonstrated that thought suppression leads to a rebound effect. The harder you try not to think about something, the more aggressively it returns. Observation as suppression does the same thing with a more socially acceptable wrapper. The emotion is not processed, it is shelved, and shelved emotions do not expire, they accumulate. This is the dark irony of misapplied mindfulness. The very tool designed to increase contact with experience becomes a method for avoiding it. The third mistake is perhaps the most important because it explains why observation can feel true in the moment and yet produce no lasting change. The mistake is watching without shifting. Let's say someone has learned to genuinely observe, not with the thinking mind, not as suppression, but with real present moment awareness. They notice a thought. They see it clearly. They do not react. And then, nothing. The thought fades. Another appears. They observe that one too, and the session ends. They go back to reacting exactly as they did before. The reason is that observation alone does not change the relationship between the person and their mental content. It changes the moment, yes. For those few seconds, there is space. But unless that space is used to do something, to make a different choice, to respond rather than react, to practice a new pattern, the old pathways remain intact. Neuroscience calls this the difference between state effects and trait effects. A state effect is temporary. You feel calm during meditation. A trait effect is permanent. You become a person who responds differently to triggers. Observation produces a state. What produces a trait is repeated practice of choosing differently in that gap between stimulus and response. And this is the second half, the part that gets left out. The part that turns observation from a pleasant exercise into an actual tool for change. The clinical term is decentering. A study by Fresco, Moore, and colleagues in 2007 defined it precisely, the ability to observe one's thoughts and feelings as temporary, objective events in the mind, rather than as reflections of the self that are necessarily true. But decentering is not passive. It is not, I see the thought and I wait. It is a specific cognitive posture, one that involves three things happening simultaneously. First, awareness, noticing the thought or feeling as it arises. This is the observation part, and it is real and it matters. Second, disidentification, recognizing that the thought is a mental event, not a fact, not an identity, not a command. This is the step that cognitive diffusion from the last video addresses directly. Third, and this is the missing piece, reorientation. Actively redirecting attention towards something chosen, not away from the thought, that would be suppression, towards something intentional, the breath, the body, a specific sensation, a question, what do I want to do right now? This third step is where the prefrontal cortex, the executive function region, actually engages. Without it, you are a spectator. With it, you are making a choice, and it is the repeated making of that choice, not the observation itself, that rewires the brain. Here's an analogy that might make this concrete. Imagine you are standing on a riverbank watching the current. Thoughts are the water. The standard advice, observe, don't react, tells you to stand on the bank and watch. Good. Better than drowning in the current, but just standing there does not change the river. It does not change you either, not in any lasting way. The second half of the advice is this. While you are standing on the bank, choose where to put your feet. Choose which direction to walk. The river will keep flowing. It is not your job to stop it, but it is your job to decide where you go next. That active choosing, in the moment of clarity that observation creates, is what builds new neural pathways. Not the watching, the choosing. And the research supports this. Antoine Lutz and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin published work in 2008 showing that advanced meditators did not just observe, they actively regulated attention. The study distinguished between two types of meditation: focused attention, where you direct the mind toward a single object, and open monitoring, where you observe whatever arises without attachment. What the researchers found was that the most experienced practitioners were not just better at open monitoring. They were better at switching between the two. They could observe and then, at will, redirect. The ability to redirect was the skill that correlated most strongly with measurable changes in brain structure, increased cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex, reduced amygdala reactivity, greater connectivity between the executive control network and the default mode network. In other words, the brain did not change from watching. It changed from the combination of watching and choosing over and over thousands of times, until the new pattern became the default. So what does this mean practically? It means that observe, don't react is the first half of a two-part instruction. The full version is closer to this: observe, and in the space that observation creates, choose. Not a big choice, not a life decision, something small. Redirect attention to the breath for 3 seconds. Notice the feeling in the chest instead of the story in the head. Ask one question: is this thought useful right now? These micro-choices, practiced consistently, are what the neuroscience actually supports, not the sitting, not the watching, the tiny, repeated act of choosing where attention goes next. There is something uncomfortable about this, because it means that observation without action is not wisdom, it is just a better seat at the same show. And there is a version of self-improvement culture that has made a virtue of the watching. The calm observer, the detached witness, the person who sees clearly and does not react. And that sounds peaceful. It sounds evolved. But if the watching never leads to a different choice, a different behavior, a different pattern, then it is just another way of staying still while calling it progress. And that is worth being honest about. Not because the practice is broken, but because the practice is only half finished. Here's the thing that connects all of this. In the last video, we looked at how the brain gets stuck in loops, the default mode network, rumination, the pathways that strengthen every time they fire. We talked about two techniques, cognitive diffusion and the 90-second rule. Both of those create a gap, a moment of space between the thought and the reaction. Observation does the same thing, when done correctly, with the experiential network, not the narrative one. But the gap is not the goal. The gap is the opportunity. What you do inside the gap is what determines whether anything changes. And that is the part that does not fit on a motivational poster. That is the quiet part. Nobody changed their life by watching. People change their lives by noticing, and then, in the next breath, choosing something different. Not once, not in a breakthrough moment, 1,000 times in the shower. At 2 in the morning. In the middle of a conversation they stopped paying attention to. The observation creates the window. The choice is what you throw through it. But knowing how to observe is one thing. Building a morning that actually supports it, that is something else entirely. And that is where we are going Saturday.